They fought a war the world couldn't see, under mud, under blood, and beneath the deadliest battlefield in history. Armed not with rifles, but with shovels and silence, they dug beneath enemy lines with one mission: blow them sky high. This is the secret war fought in the shadows of World War I, a story buried for over a century. Before we take you into the earth-shaking truth of World War I's hidden battlefields, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the stories they don't teach in school. Asterisk, they thought trench warfare was the worst it could get. Shells screamed overhead. Barbed wire coiled like metal serpents. Men fought for months to gain just a few feet of blasted ground. But beneath those blood-soaked trenches, something far more terrifying was happening. A different kind of war, a silent, suffocating war was taking shape. One where you wouldn't hear your enemy scream, but feel him beneath your boots. It began in 1914, as the Western Front froze into stalemate. Artillery and machine guns turned every battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The generals were desperate. How do you break through a front that stretches for hundreds of miles, defended by concrete bunkers and endless wire? The answer came not from military strategy, but from deep underground. Britain, facing German trenches, fortified beyond belief, turned to an unexpected source of power: coal miners. These men weren't soldiers. They were laborers from Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, used to working in suffocating dark, crawling through tunnels barely wider than their shoulders. The British Army formed a special unit just for them, the tunneling companies. Their job? Dig underneath the enemy, pack the earth with explosives, and detonate entire sectors of the front line. But this wasn't just digging. This was a race against time. The Germans were doing the same. Beneath the surface, a second war unfolded, a cat-and-mouse game of silent listening, directionless digging, and explosive consequences. The men would lie down with their ears pressed against the cold soil, using crude devices called geophones to detect faint sounds: a shovel scrape, a cough, a breath. If they heard the enemy, they had to act fast, either collapse their tunnel or charge in with bayonets in hand. Fighting in pitch black with death only inches away, these tunnelers faced horrors most infantrymen never imagined. The tunnels could collapse at any moment. Pockets of poison gas drifted through cracks in the earth. There was no light, no air circulation, and the sound of distant explosions could mean anything: success, failure, or their own doom. Rats were constant companions, and the stench of decay crept through the walls. Time felt warped in the darkness. One soldier later said, "A day underground felt like a week in hell." And yet the stakes were enormous. If a tunneling operation succeeded, it could destroy entire regiments in seconds. One good explosion could shift the course of a battle or the war itself. So they dug and dug, inch by inch. In places like Ypres, Loos, and Vimy Ridge, the earth below the trenches became a deadly labyrinth of listening posts, trap chambers, and explosive vaults waiting for the signal to ignite. As these men worked in total silence, they knew one thing: if they were detected, the enemy would dig a counter-tunnel and set off explosives to bury them alive. They weren't just risking their lives. They were gambling on the earth, not betraying them. What they built, what they endured, remains one of the most overlooked but critical chapters of the First World War. Their picks and shovels struck not just dirt, but history. They weren't heroes in the headlines. They weren't generals with medals. They were the silent warriors of World War I, and their war was just beginning. Asterisk, the war beneath the trenches was a nightmare carved in silence. It was not fought with roaring artillery or the clash of rifles. It was fought in darkness, in airless tunnels carved deep under the battlefield, by men who had to listen harder than they breathed. The British tunneling companies, mostly made up of coal miners, sewer workers, and men who had never held a gun in combat, were tasked with one of the most dangerous jobs in World War I: digging beneath enemy lines to plant explosives that could turn the tide of a battle with a single thunderous blast. Every descent into the tunnels was a gamble with death. These underground warriors didn't wear medals or stand in parades. They worked in suffocating conditions, often on their hands and knees, crawling through damp soil and choking darkness. The walls of the tunnels dripped with groundwater. The air was stale and heavy, and the only light came from the weak flicker of carbide lamps or candles, barely strong enough to pierce the black. They carried no guns, only picks, shovels, and the weight of knowing that at any moment the earth could collapse, a gas pocket could open, or the enemy might be digging toward them with the same deadly intent. Silence wasn't just preferred, it was essential. Talking was rare, and even breathing was done carefully. The slightest sound could give away their position to enemy listeners. Above them, the world was exploding with shellfire. But below, it was still eerily, dangerously still. And in that stillness, every vibration, every scratch in the soil could be the enemy. German tunnelers were doing the exact same thing. Sometimes only feet apart, both sides dug blindly toward one another. If they heard the enemy coming, they had seconds to decide collapse their own tunnel to stop and advance, or fight in the dark with knives and pistols in close, suffocating quarters. They used geophones' early sound detectors to listen for movement. A trained ear could tell if the sound was friendly digging, a collapsing shaft, or enemy miners breaking through. These devices were crude, but vital. At night, the tunnelers lay motionless, ears pressed against the soil, straining to hear even the faintest scrape of a German shovel. If detected, the race began to dig faster, to plant explosives first, or to intercept the enemy in an underground ambush. In some cases, the tunnelers would strike first. Silent raids were launched deep underground, where men fought hand to hand, in pitch blackness. Pistols, knives, even fists were used in brutal, close-range battles where one wrong movement could bring the ceiling down and bury everyone inside. These fights were rarely reported in newspapers. They left no glorious headlines, but they were just as deadly, if not more, than what happened above ground. Tunnels stretched for hundreds of feet in every direction. Engineers mapped them carefully, but the conditions were unpredictable. The deeper they went, the hotter it became. In some shafts, oxygen was so low that candles wouldn't stay lit. Miners would faint from exhaustion or gas buildup, and sometimes they were pulled out unconscious, only to return the next day. The threat of countermining was constant. The Germans used camouflaged small explosive charges to collapse British tunnels and bury the men alive. Survivors described hearing screams through the earth, men trapped beneath tons of soil, dying. Slowly in the dark, yet despite all of this, they kept digging, because every inch they gained underground was an inch closer to victory, and every mine successfully placed meant thousands of enemy soldiers wiped out in an instant. These men, whose names are barely remembered, played a deadly, invisible role in the war's most brutal campaigns. They fought not with noise, but with silence, not with force, but with patience. And the ground itself was their battlefield. Theirs was a war of inches, shadows, and breathless courage, and it changed the very nature of warfare forever. The night before the attack was so still, it was unnatural. A heavy fog clung to the earth. The birds had gone silent. Soldiers along the British front whispered, moved slowly, and looked down at the ground not out of fear, but because they knew what was buried beneath it. For over a year, hundreds of men had worked in absolute secrecy to create one of the most devastating weapons of World War I: 19 tunnels. Over 450 tons of explosives, all waiting for the signal to tear the earth apart. This was Messines Ridge, and what happened here changed the face of war forever. The operation was unlike anything ever attempted. The British had spent months digging deep beneath German positions near Ypres, Belgium, carving out massive underground chambers with one purpose: destruction. These weren't small sabotage mines. These were colossal, cathedral-sized vaults, packed with ammonel and blasting gelatin, wired and timed with surgical precision. Tunneling companies had fought through mud, enemy patrols, and the constant threat of German counterminers just to place these explosives. Many of the tunnelers didn't survive long enough to see the explosion. Some were buried alive in collapses. Others were caught in silent underground skirmishes, never to be seen again, asterisk, but those who remained knew what they had built. The scale was unimaginable. Each mine was capable of leveling everything above it: trenches, machine gun nests, bunkers, and the thousands of soldiers stationed there. And the Germans had no idea how close death really was. Asterisk at exactly 3:10 a.m. on June 7, 1917. The ground itself screamed. In a fraction of a second, 19 mines detonated simultaneously along a stretch of the German front line. The explosions were so powerful, they were heard across the English Channel in London. Witnesses said the earth lifted into the sky, fire erupting in massive plumes that reached hundreds of feet high. German soldiers vanished in an instant, torn apart before they even had time to stand. Craters hundreds of feet wide swallowed men, trees, and entire bunkers whole. In less than 30 seconds, over 10,000 German troops were gone. Asterisk, it was the largest man-made explosion in history at the time, and its psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Surviving German soldiers stumbled from the rubble, in shock, disoriented, many surrendering without a fight. British troops surged forward, taking ground that had resisted capture for years. Messines was one of the rare moments in World War I when everything went according to plan. Asterisk, but the victory came at a cost rarely remembered. The tunnelers, those silent soldiers who dug through the bowels of the earth, had made this possible. Their war was unseen, their deaths uncounted in the headlines. Yet without them, the Battle of Messines would never have happened. What they achieved beneath the surface shook the world above it. In a war where millions died in the mud, it was the men who dug through it who gave one of the LA's clearest victories. And they did it all without firing a single shot. The war eventually ended, but the silence below the trenches never truly broke. The men who had fought in the dark, who had dug through mud and bone and fear, returned not to parades but to forgotten streets and empty hands. No monuments stood in their honor. No songs were written about their bravery. Yet without them, key victories like Messines and Vimy Ridge may never have been won. These were the tunnelers of World War I, ghosts of a hidden battlefield who gave everything and received little in return. They didn't march. They didn't charge. But they shook the earth beneath the enemy's feet. Asterisk, after the guns fell silent in 1918, the great powers began to count their losses. Millions dead, cities flattened, empires broken. But the story of the men who fought underground was largely left out of the history books. Their war was too strange, too invisible. It didn't fit the romantic narrative of heroism and glory. It was dirty, slow, and terrifying. Yet it was no less important. These miners, sappers, and engineers had played a strategic role that shaped the outcomes of some of the most critical battles of the war. They had risked their lives to collapse trenches, destroy bunkers, and strike terror into enemy lines without ever seeing the sky. Asterisk, the psychological toll of their work was immense. Many tunnelers came home with what we now know as PTSD, shaken by the memories of being trapped underground, hearing the muffled sounds of enemy picks getting closer, feeling the earth tremble under their elbows. They dreamed of the darkness, of gas filling narrow shafts, of comrades buried alive just inches away. Some never escaped the claustrophobia. They couldn't sleep in rooms without windows. Others avoided basements for the rest of their lives. But because they weren't frontline troops, their trauma was rarely acknowledged. They were considered laborers, not fighters. But they fought a war just as deadly and perhaps even more terrifying than anything above ground. Asterisk, in the decades that followed, most of the tunnels were abandoned. Some collapsed. Others were sealed off, lost beneath layers of war and time, but a few remain. Silent chambers beneath the fields of France and Belgium, holding the rusted tools and forgotten helmets of men who gave everything for inches of land. In recent years, archaeologists and historians have begun to rediscover these subterranean battlegrounds. They've uncovered carvings in the walls, names, prayers, drawings left behind by men who didn't know if they would ever see daylight. Again, personal messages etched in the silence of the earth. A kind of underground time capsule. whispering a story that was nearly lost forever. The legacy of the tunnelers reaches beyond their victories. They revolutionized military engineering. Their techniques would be studied and used in future conflicts, from World War II to Vietnam. Tunneling became a recognized method of warfare, one that began not with generals but with coal miners turned soldiers. They showed that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's buried in the mud, breathing shallow in a tunnel, knowing that each dig of your shovel could be your last. Their bravery reminds us that not all battles are fought in the open. Some are fought beneath our feet in silence by men the world tried to forget. But now their story has been unearthed piece by piece, tunnel by tunnel, memory by memory. And it deserves to be remembered. If this hidden chapter of World War I moved you, help us keep these stories alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history that goes beyond the textbook. Let's bring the forgotten heroes back into the light, one story at a time.